and welcome to the Religious Studies Project. I am David McConaughey, and she is...
Brianne Fallon and Hayes.
David Robertson. Thanks for having me on the show, guys. It's a real privilege. Been a fan for a long time.
We're so happy to have you.
So, I was supposed to introduce the episode. I've just remembered. Okay, so this week we have a podcast we've been waiting quite a while to put up, actually. Been looking forward to this one for a long time. It's called Reflections on the Thinking with Jonathan Z. Smith Conference. And it's by Andie Alexander, and she's speaking to Aaron Hughes. And this was recorded at the NTNU. What's that? NTNU?
Norwegian University for Science and Technology.
Wonderful.
Amazing. Trondheim. Yes, in Trondheim in Norway. So take it away, Andie.
Welcome to the Religious Studies Project. I'm Andie Alexander, a doctoral student at Emory University, and joining me today is Dr. Aaron Hughes of the University of Rochester. We are here in Trondheim, Norway, following the Thinking with Jonathan Z. Smith conference that is hosted at the Norwegian Institute for Science and Technology. And we're here to talk about the legacy of Smith and his work, his contribution, and ways in which we can move forward in the field. So, Aaron, hi. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Andie. How you doing?
Great. You enjoying Norway?
I am. Very beautiful.
It's nice.
The midnight sun reminds me of my childhood in Edmonton, Alberta.
There you go. As long as I've been here, it's only been daylight, so I don't know if the sun sets, but it's been nice.
I think it sets at like 1, and then gets up at like 3.
It's very nice. Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about Smith. Let's talk about what we've discussed and see what questions we have.
Sounds great. Let's do it. I think we should probably begin everything by saying that Smith has probably been the most important theoretician over the past 50 years, half century. I think he's so important. So I'll talk about the past before we talk about what I. So I think that probably he more than anyone was responsible for smashing the Eliadean phenomenological paradigm. The problem is even though that paradigm should be long dead and buried, it's still one that our students gravitate towards, and still one that a number of our colleagues gravitate towards. And I think that's what I try to say a couple of times. It's when we are in these rarefied environments of people who are more critical, we just think that we're all the same and we preach to the converted. Whereas, when we walk along the halls of the AAR, look at some of the papers that are given there, they fall back a lot on that old phenomenological model. So I think that's Smith's main importance. I think so. Smith, and I think this is we all fall in his legacy, refused to treat religion as special, as sui generis. So or as unique unique in the ontological sense. It might be unique to us, but ontologically it's not unique, because if it's not unique, then you can't compare it to anything else. And I think that's the beauty of him, is that it was able to show the incongruous relationship between the quote-unquote religious and the quote-unquote mundane. So I think that's where, and I think the other thing that I think that came up a number of times at the conference was the ludic or the playful dimension of Smith. But the flip side of that is his he was so knowledgeable and so comfortable, whereas when we get undergraduates, they're not comfortable and they don't have nearly this type of education that he did. So there's a problem of translation. I think the other thing that's great about Smith is his broad comparative, or his broad vision. And I think that's something that a lot of us don't share, because again, that goes against what we're taught in graduate school. So it's funny, I think when I talk to a number of people like this, a lot of the people here who work with Smith, I think really only began to appreciate Smith like after graduate school. Because then you're afforded the sort of the slowness of reading him and appreciating him.
I could see that. It's sort of different given that I got to read him in undergrad, because
yeah, right.
there's a different sort of introduction.
Right,
And,
at Alabama. Yeah, definitely.
And so, in the same sense, it's something that I think is important for people to at least have, like, in their repertoire, but something that I find is often not taught in grad school, but it's never much, and it's always highly contested.
Yeah. I think I said in my lecture that I never encountered Smith till graduate school. We just read, people like Eliade and Weber, and maybe there was a reason for that. I mean, maybe the person that taught the course thought, well, you'll get Smith later, so let's. So that was good for me, is because I read first all the things that Smith would later be critical of. By the time I came to Smith, it was like, okay, I can see that.
I think that, too, the distinction you're making between seeing religion as unique for us and not ontologically unique is something that is lost partly in that religions chapter that he wrote.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect as I read it, it was provocative, but probably meant it. But not in the way I suspect that a lot of people want to contend with.
Yeah.
And it's easier to dismiss because, as you said, he was pushing back against the whole phenomenological paradigm, I suppose. And while, especially given the group here, we are relatively on the same page and think that this should be obvious, that this should be something that everyone is doing. And that's something you mentioned in your keynote. How is this not something that's just common knowledge across the academy?
I think we realize, because I think a lot of people still believe in the sacred, or a lot of people still believe that religion, I think this is where the problem is we live in a very chaotic world where religions, quote unquote, don't seem to like one another particularly much. I think this really comes to the fore after 9/11. So a lot of people in religious studies think that religious studies can be that which facilitates conversation between religions. So I always joke to my students, it's like, I didn't spend 10 years in graduate school to be an interfaith dialogue facilitator. As much as important as that work is, so really. So oftentimes I'll try to get Jews and Muslims to talk together, but not under the auspices of the academic classroom. Because I think, as I've said before, I think the religions get along better when they talk to one another as opposed to when they shout at one another. But I do think a lot of people in the Religious Studies Academy think that that's the goal of religious studies, is to show the similarities between religions. I disagree. I think Smith would disagree. But I think I always worry that Smith was on point. Smith was edgy. Smith was critical. Smith really encourages us to do that. But the two things that I worry about, as I said in the keynote, are those people that will just write him off as another dead white guy, which I said is absolutely stupid given the fact that he wasn't even white, he was Jewish. But that's another matter. And the second thing that I think we'll see is is to see how the field will inoculize Smith, so that he'll just become like a little name or a trope, and people can invoke him, but they'll do it in a way that takes off the edge. And I think we see that. I've seen it a lot.
Yeah.
So everyone can say, oh, well, according to Smith, blah, blah, blah. But then they'll never quite follow through in what Smith wanted us to do.
I think you're right. And I think in some ways what he was working against then with his work and pushing back against the Eliadean model, I think we have a different version of it that's sort of present in the academy now. It's maybe not as overt, but I think it's there. And so to me, I suspect there's still some push that has to happen. There's still something that has conversations to be had within the discipline and how it works. And I think part of my concern in those conversations is the dismissal of Smith.
Yeah, no, I think so.
It's reductive. All of those sort of critiques that get applied to his work.
Yeah.
And what I find is that there's very little engagement with it if one has even read it.
Well, I think just as Smith goes against our traditional ways of reading and thinking about religion, I think the modern academy goes against Smith. So on the one hand, our students come in woefully ignorant about what religion is. So we can't engage the type of work that Smith wants until much later. So, I mean, you can't have redescription without description. So I think we spend a lot of, at least the classes we teach at the freshman and sophomore level, trying to describe to students what hopefully, if they stay for later classes, we can begin to redescribe. The other thing is, I think with the contemporary academy, we're always encouraged to do community engagement. And so, I mean, the job interviews will ask people, so how will you interact with the community? What will you do with them? And I think in interacting with the community, we have certain expectations that go against what Smith... I don't think Smith ever interacted with the local Jewish community. Yeah. So I don't think the local communities are really amenable to the type of conversation that Smith had. So I think we have to fight back. I think that's what some of us would do. But I think the key as we move forward is how to keep the edge of a Smithian analysis, and how to apply it so it just doesn't become a bromide, which is what I think a lot of people would like it to become.
Developing what Smith was doing, trying to continue to push it forward, especially given the requirements both of the job market, of service for the school, the department.
Yeah.
Because certainly that's shifted over the past 20 years alone. And there is the community engagement is something very big, and there's a huge focus on doing that sort of work. And I think that it can be very productive, but as a discipline, we're still figuring out how to do that successfully, I think.
Yeah.
In ways that we can both learn, but also interpret and translate, and in service of larger concerns and issues, both in the community, the discipline, the nation.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. I mean, rarely will you see a job in just, theory and method in the study of religion. I think in the past 20 years, I maybe seen 3 or 4 of those. So one always has to be trained in a tradition. And I'm not sure if Smith was trained in the tradition. I mean, his thesis was his dissertation was on the Golden Bough. Mm-hmm. So Smith was a generalist at a time when religious studies is into particularists. So the question, I think, becomes, how can you translate a Smithian analysis or a Smithian type analysis into the particular fields? And that's difficult. I mean, as we saw with some of the papers here that tried to engage Smith from the level of area studies, there had to be a lot of remedial work that they'd had to do for us who weren't in that tradition in order to get to a small Smithian point. So I think as we move forward, how to translate Smith into area studies will not be easy. But maybe that's the point. I mean, that if as one of the points that came out several times in the conference was the playful or ludic dimension of Smith. Maybe that's the method. I mean, it is to show the playfulness or the ludic dimension of what we work on, or how, quote unquote, sacred kingship in Tibet is no more special than any other type of power or hierarchy. So maybe that's it. Is the playful dimension? Maybe that's his method. I mean, did he have a method other than showing the religious is not qualitatively different than non-religious?
Yeah, I mean, I think
self-reflexivity.
It was
maybe.
Self-reflexivity. I think that is certainly something that's required, as came up in many of our conversations. Yeah. But maybe coupled with that playfulness.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. And I think that Smith's message, on one hand, is very simple. We need to be self-conscious, self-reflexive scholars who don't treat religion as then somehow special or different from other more mundane things. And I think that's where the playfulness comes through. So the question becomes, how do you translate that into particular religions, which and in area studies, which tend to be a lot more serious and not engaged in play, and how do you translate that into a pedagogical idiom or idiom working with the communities, which are not accustomed to think about religion in a playful way because this is what the Bible says you're supposed to do, or this is what the Quran says. So I think the classroom is easier to translate that than the community, but it still poses its set of problems. In our conversation yesterday, we said that where Smith tried to translate some of his more theoretical ideas was in the dictionary. I'm not sure how successful the dictionary was. I mean, no one engaged the dictionary here. We rarely talk about that. We talk about the essays in his main publications, but we never talk about the dictionary. In fact, I haven't looked at the dictionary in ages. I want to actually go back and look at it. So yeah, it's hard, but maybe the main translation of that is to get students to be playful with religion. I think that's the way I try to do it, is so that they can joke about it. Obviously, I think it's easy in the community too. But yeah. As we move forward, and I think I said that in the lecture, is that we have to absorb Smith's critique, we have to absorb his wit, and we have to absorb his edge, but create new edges and new wits as a way to move forward. Because if not, as I said, we'll just make them into a name or slogan that doesn't have any venom. And I think that maybe the way to do that is to bring them into the study of particular religions, which isn't easy. The main thing that I really like about Smith is that he encourages us to use our imaginations.
And I agree. For Smith, he does encourage that. He encourages odd comparisons that might not make sense, and tracing historical etymologies and to have a better conception of how we talk about religion
and human activity.
Yeah.
It's hard because, I agree, and I think that's the way it should be. But ultimately, if you're in an area, so like in Islamic studies, my work has to be adjudicated by people in Islamic studies that might or might not, and chances are might not, come out of religious studies. So, so you always have to move back and forth between trying to make theoretical contributions to the field of religious studies, but with the realization that people in religious studies might not read it because it's in Islamic studies or Jewish studies or Buddhist studies or whatever, and at the same time write in such a way that those people that would naturally read it, people in those area studies, would be able to understand the argument. So that's always the trick. I think I've been able to do it well, but I don't think it's easy. And I think I've tried to pave a path for young scholars in Islamic studies to try to do that. Whether it's successful or not, I don't know. We'll see. But that's I think the main one of the as we move forward, that will be one of the issues, is how to translate Smith. And we talked about that. We talked about. I know Daniel Barbu and Nick Malin in Geneva or in Switzerland have tried to translate Smith into French. I'm not sure to what effect. I'm part of a project that's trying to translate Smith into Italian. Again, I don't know how to again, it came up several times. How do you translate Smith for an undergraduate American audience is one thing, but how do you translate it for an Italian audience or a French audience or a Polish audience is another thing. And I don't think that's easy. But I think Smith should be translated into other languages. Probably maybe not a word for word translation, but a more conceptual type of translation. How do you take the playful aspect in English and translate it into Italian? You can't do it. You have to translate. You have to be playful in Italian in order to so it becomes this very difficult process. But all translation is difficult. You can say, do you want a literal translation or do you want a conceptual translation? And I think It's the conceptual translation, both at the literal level in other languages and into other fields within religious studies, that will be the difficulty moving forward. But I think it can happen. I think it will happen. I think most of us here are committed to make that happen.
Yeah, I think so. I think it, as it was mentioned, it doesn't happen overnight, those changes. Yeah. Which I think that, to me at least, is why having more productive work happening in the classroom early on and not following the method of just give information, undo it later.
Yeah, I like to see, I kind of like, because I have to work with Islamic studies and most people don't know anything about Islam, I really have to begin by making sure they know the narratives and ideally know the texts and the languages. Because then I think you can learn the theoretical stuff. And I know probably people would disagree with me here, but I'm old-fashioned that way. But I think you need the description, and I think you need the details and the facts. But later you can say that, well, no facts are facts. They're simply ideologies going by under the guise of whatever. But I think students need that. And then they can play, because you can't play unless you know the rules of the game.
That's true. You have to know the rules, and I think that's key. But where I think I'm going to push on that is that most people are not going to play. They're not going to be here, right? And so if we're talking to an undergraduate class of 100 people, and this is the humanities credit that they get, what then? Because they're not going to remember the narratives of Islam. They're not going to remember different facts about any world religions.
Yeah, that's tough.
And so is the key then that they have all of that data that makes them feel more confident in saying, I know what true Islam is, versus being able to weigh those claims of authority and authenticity against one another. Yeah,
well, you're right. I always speak out of our own context, and I'm lucky is because we don't have humanities requirements at my university. People are in the class because they want to be in the class. And I think if I'm playful enough in the class, then they'll come into the second and third level classes. So, yes. So I don't have to, I've never dealt with that. Mm-hmm. But if I did have to teach, like the largest class I teach is like 18 to 20 students, all who want to be there, and who do the reading. So if I had to teach these big, I couldn't even imagine doing it. I don't know what I'd do. I really don't. I mean, I guess you're right. How do you transmit the information, but the same way let them know that the information is wafer thin?
It's contingent.
Yes. So that's, that is the, that's the way, that's a tough question. And I don't have to think about that too much, right? Which is a cop out. But I know if I taught at a large state university, for sure, I'd have to think about that.
Well, I think that is part of it, right? The ways in which any discipline is approached varies so drastically across universities.
But that's what Smith said. But that's a great point, because Smith taught at the type of place that I teach at. Mm-hmm. So very bright undergraduates, like some of the brightest in the country, who probably had some idea of what the religions were, and then he could kind of work to undermine that. So, like where I teach an introduction to Jewish history class, and most of the students are Jewish. They've come out of often Jewish day schools in the New York City, Boston area. They know their stuff, like they know the data. But I get them at the classroom because they're very bright, who think, well, you know what, maybe my parents, maybe not all doesn't quite make sense. So so at the introductory level, I can probably do what people at a large state university can only do at the third or fourth year. And I wonder if Smith probably had something similar to that. as he must have, taught. So I think that every institution is different. And there's large state universities, there's the liberal arts colleges, and then there's like the elite private university, Research One universities that have different constituencies. And maybe that would have been a good workshop, is translating Smith into the undergraduate classroom. But heck, I don't even think we can translate them. Most people can't even translate them into their own areas of research. How they translate them into the classroom is not easy. Because I think to go back to where we began is Smith asks us to do what the modern academy. Smith asks us to do that which is the opposite of what the modern academy encourages us to do, which is to read quickly, to read fast, to not have an imagination, and to not take pedagogy seriously. And I think that all of Smith's work shows that no, you have to do those things.
I think, it absolutely does to me, and I think that's something that is lost given the requirements both of grad students and tenure track faculty, instructors, of course, that there's so many demands on production that there's not enough time to really investigate something that might not be in your area or work through how to apply something. And this was a question I think that came up in terms of applying Smith, that should we be trying to strive for a literal, intentional understanding of Smith as the author, or should we take what we can, whether he's taught in the classroom explicitly or referenced, and adapt it, try to apply those ideas in ways that might not be obvious, but, well, if we're going to talk about the other, let's consider issues of immigration or...
Yeah.
And that way you can bring it in, even though his EGs are not anything that I would use personally in a class, or even overlap with the area I work in. But try to take some sort of nugget or something from his approach in terms of shaping our own approach. Because as you mentioned, that's a key thing for Smith is how he is approaching his own research. Yeah.
I think Smith might say, forget about me. I'm gone. But take some of the tools that I've tried to play with and work with them. You don't even have to mention my name. You don't have to even say J.Z. Smith said this. Just take the self-reflexivity, take the playful element, take the comparison. And again, I mean, like when Smith says a comparison, you can't compare X to Y without having a third term, Z. I mean, like on one hand, that's so obvious, but on the other hand, it's so deep. But I think Smith would say, well, just move forward. I'd like to think that's what he would say. Forget about me. Just keep the creativity, keep the self-reflexivity, realize that the terms you use probably have baggage in them, and don't simply replicate them. That's what I've learned from Smith. I think for me, one of my main goals is to try to take some of the complicated Smithian and other analysis that we have in religious studies, at least in the critical wing of religious studies, and translate them into area studies, which is not easy, and you have to do it in a particular way. But I think I've done it with a certain amount of success. So I think that's like, how do you take 9th century Arabic texts and ask certain questions of them? Not flatten them by asking certain questions, but how do you appreciate the text on their own terms and at the same time ask questions of them that come out of that which Assyrian method people do?
Yeah. And I think that is the key, because when we are at a conference like this, there's a luxury of working with people who are all sort of working toward the same goal and are concerned for those issues, but then translating that into our own fields and to others in the academy.
And that's difficult, as we saw with some of the more technical papers on the second day. I mean, there's a lot of descriptive work, or say someone working on South Asia or East Asia, in order to bring the rest of us up to speed, there has to be a lot of sort of descriptive and informative work, and only then can they get to the questions. And I think because the papers were so short, that sometimes it was difficult to get to those questions because of all the background work. But that's good, though. I think that's good, because I don't think Smith would say, "Oh yeah, we should just all, give up working in areas or with text and just ask these questions." I think he would say that we have to, that some of us should do that work.
Yeah, I mean, we have to engage that, and I think what's good too with the technical papers that we heard, it is hearing from other disciplines and not talking only to your discipline. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what highlights, at least in my way of thinking, Smith's goal in terms of playing with ideas and asking different questions. Because when you are listening to a paper on East Asia and I do American religion, then what we have in common is not our area. Mm-hmm. So if we're going to talk to each other productively, as I would hope we would, we have to have a way of doing that.
Yeah, we have to have a common set of questions. I think that's what Smith really, that's his, I think that would be his definition of the field, where people working with different texts and different traditions and different data sets can learn from one another by asking similar sets of questions. And to me, that's religious studies at its best. But again, it's for those in more area studies like myself, is a trade-off between being able to do that and at the same time being able to speak to just those people that work with Arabic texts or other types of Islamic texts, which isn't easy, but it can be done.
It can be, and I think the only way to impact area studies in a way that could push it to a more potentially Smithian model is to do that and to bring that work there. And we can't also just talk to ourselves.
Yes, exactly.
And it's easy to do, but again, that goes against the whole point. We have to engage across areas and disciplines within religious studies.
Yes. And also realize that sometimes area studies have a lot to teach us too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's important.
I think so.
And I really think that's that'll be Smith's legacy. I think that's he on one hand he didn't ask too much of us, but on the other hand he asks everything of us. To rethink ourselves and rethink our own relationship to that which we study, and if it's found wanting, to transform.
And thanks so much to Andie and Aaron for that brilliant interview. We have had Aaron on the show before. You can go back into the archives and listen to his interview. But I think we told the story a couple of weeks ago. We never managed to get J.Z. Smith on the podcast ourselves, which is a shame, but this is hopefully the next best thing. Now, Dave, I'm sure you are well acquainted with J.Z. Smith's work, having studied in America, right?
Oh, absolutely. It was one of the very first things that I did as a master's student at Miami University in Ohio with Jim Hanges, who had actually studied with J.Z., and day one of the comparative methods course, there we are sitting down with imagining religion and working our way right through the devil in Jonestown there at the end, which I still use with students to this day. Absolutely essential material for my teaching with undergraduates. Bree, you work in a museum, but you've also taught in university. What are your experiences with J.Z.?
I remember the first time I came across J.Z. Smith, it was in my third year of undergrad, and we did a course called Rethinking Religion. And the first reading we did was the In Comparison, A Magic Dwells section from Imagining Religion. And I just remember the complete sort of rocking of the foundation of everything I'd been taught up until that point, of the idea that, of looking through, a Christian sort of framework lens. And I just remember that being a turning point in my understanding of religious studies. And I think he was probably key to my love of it in some sort of way, just because of his complete sort of analysis of the comparison of different religions, and his take on that sort of golden bough idea is just something that made me really passionate about it. And I probably will never forget the first time I came across J.Z. Smith. But what about you, David? Do you remember the first time you encountered him?
Well, J.Z. Smith's legacy in Europe is somewhat different. We never really... I don't think I ever, as an undergraduate or master's, got set a J.Z. Smith text. Rather, my encounter with his writings came through people like Russell McCutcheon, and specifically that quote, there is no data for religion.
Right.
And which I think is from Imagining Religion, is it? But
that's from Religions, Religious, I believe.
That's right, yeah. And I went, and sort of after coming across that, I as an undergraduate, found that quite hard to pin down what he was saying. And I went and read a few other things, and I didn't really get them at the time. I found them beautifully written and kind of fascinating to read, but I couldn't quite get a hold of anything. He writes like like some of the European philosophers in that sense.
Right. Well, when he cites
Go ahead.
Wittgenstein, right? When he's bringing Wittgenstein in at the end of the essay, and you're trying to give it to undergraduates, and they're like, "Who's Wittgenstein?" And you're like, "Please."
Well,
please.
Wittgenstein's writing is the other end of the spectrum. It's
right.
Incredibly precise and sort of boiled down. But I'm thinking more of people like like Sartre and Camus, even Deleuze and people like this. Even Bruno Latour is the same. There are these magical little phrases in it, but following the argument is really, really difficult. But I think now I'm kind of ready to go back and read them. I think now I would get it. I hope so, anyway.
Yeah, it's quite poetic. I remember thinking that at the time. And your comparison to Latour, I definitely see that connection with that sort of, it's almost an art form in and of itself, as well as the argument. And so sometimes you get so caught up in the beauty of the narrative that, you're sort of trying to sift through for the argument, but you'll eventually get there once you get through all the beautiful language.
When I read Mircea Eliade's Sacred and Profane as an undergraduate, and then you go to Imagining Religion as a master's student, and you read The Bare Facts of Ritual, which is just a brutal takedown of the idea of the Axis Mundi. I think that's one of those ones that I think actually really connected with me immediately, beyond the prose and beyond the potential highlight of the turn of a phrase that I think he was definitely well known for. So what do we have next time, David?
We have another interview with Sydney Castillo, who has been a real powerhouse this year. This one is entitled Doctors and Stigmatics in the 19th and 20th Centuries, and that is with Gabor Klanishi. So come back next week to find out a little bit more about medical discourse and mysticism in 19th and 20th century Europe.
And until then, we all say,
thanks for
listening.
The Religious Studies Project is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The Religious Studies Project is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SC047750.
Brought to you by editors Brianne Fallon and David McConaughey, and founding editors Chris Cotter, that's me, and David Robertson, that's him. Our features are edited by Rebecca Barrett-Fox, with marketing managed by Benjamin Marcus. Our Opportunities Digest managed by Ella Buck, podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, and social media managed by Ray Radford.
Don't forget, you can support the project by using our amazon.com.co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, iTunes, and other portals. Thanks for listening.